stand. Court is now sitting.
Good morning, Mr. Castleton.
Your Honour, the first witness this morning is Sergeant Derek Fenton. I understand that Sergeant Fenton is in the virtual waiting room and can be brought in and sworn.
Good morning, Sergeant Fenton. Can you see and hear us?
I can. Good morning.
Good morning. You'll just hear from the court officer now.
Sergeant Fenton, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath for the affirmation?
Affirmation, please.
Silence, please. Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Sergeant, would you please state your full name?
My name is Derek Charles Fenton.
And are you a sergeant within the New South Wales Police Force attached to the Forensic Evidence and Technical Support Command?
That is correct.
And were you tasked with undertaking an analysis of a RFS vehicle rollover that occurred in the Dingelic area on the 30th of December 2019?
That is correct.
And as a result of that analysis, have you produced an expert report dated the 18th of July 2020?
That is correct.
Do you have a copy of your report with you today?
I do.
Do you adhere to the opinions that you've expressed therein?
I do.
Did you attend the scene of the rollover on the property known as Lightwood?
No, I did not personally.
There are a number of photographs contained within your report. Can I ask you who provided those photographs to you?
I don't recall the name of the investigator, but I have access to the images recorded by the various crime scene sections. So upon receiving the request for assistance, I'm able to provide myself access to it through the police systems.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just ask you to set out in general terms your education, qualifications, training and experience in relation to the investigation of motor vehicle collisions, and in particular those collisions or incidents that involve heavy vehicle rollovers?
I commenced predominantly this line of employment. I've been a police officer for 19 years. However, I joined the New South Wales Police Crash Investigation Unit nearly 12 years ago, and I was a crash investigator for about 4 years before moving to the Forensic Evidence and Technical Support Command, where I commenced doing collision reconstruction, it's a more scientific analysis. During that time, I did a number of courses associated with motor vehicle collision investigation and the subsequent analysis generally. These courses each touch upon different parts of collision investigation and the physics associated with it. However, predominantly with heavy vehicle rollover, towards the end of my training, when completing the Certificate 4 in motor vehicle collision analysis, we started to look at tangential forces and the physics associated with it, and delving into what we refer to as a vehicle's propensity to roll, which is a term associated with heavy vehicle rollover. Thank
you. Did you have access to any statements obtained by New South Wales Police from the occupants of the particular vehicle, the subject of your investigation, or not? I have access to them. However, my analysis or what I'm able to do exists in a realm of physics and mathematics. So while testimony from witnesses and people involved is very relevant to the wider investigation, in terms of what I can establish mathematically, it doesn't carry a great deal of weight. Not to say that's not correct, but I can't feed in an opinion into
a mathematical equation. So I base all of my analysis within the measured scientific world.
I understand. And as a result of your analysis, did you form the opinion that while the heavy vehicle rolled onto its roof, it was not involved in a driving-related rollover collision?
That is correct.
And how did you come to that opinion?
There were images of certain gouge marks associated with the rollover event, and this is contained within my report. And within the report, I highlight them specifically and how they relate to the rollover sequence itself.
All right, pausing there, to assist Her Honour, I might have that photograph which has the relevant gouge marks displayed brought up onto the screen. It's found, Your Honour, at page 270 of Exhibit 12. And there are a number of gouge marks which Sergeant Fenton has highlighted, as you'll see in a moment when it comes up on the screen. Now, as I recall, Sergeant, there are 4 distinct gouges in the dirt surface adjacent to where the relevant vehicle lay in situ. Firstly, can I ask you this? Did you form the opinion that these were all produced during the rollover phase?
Yes, I don't have the benefit of physically examining them myself. However, through deductive reasoning and an examination, well, a close examination of the photographs, I believe that they are produced by parts of the truck as it rolled onto its side before toppling onto its roof.
And in terms of that deductive process to which you just referred, having regard to those distinct gouges in the dirt surface, did you form the opinion that the vehicle rolled onto its right-hand side before coming to rest on its roof?
That is correct.
And if you could just explain, by having regard to the various gouge marks displayed in the image on the screen, how it was that those particular gouge marks led you to that conclusion that it's rolled onto its right-hand side before coming to rest on its roof?
Working through them sequentially, the gouge marks identified within the red circle, which are between evidence markers A and B, while in this image itself isn't terribly clear, in other images it's very clearly produced by a tyre. It contains tyre tread pattern and is a single tyre. I took from that it was most likely produced by the truck's front offside, or the driver's side tyre. The second gouge mark, which is highlighted with the purple or magenta circle, which is between evidence markers C and D, similar in the respect that it was clearly produced by a tyre or a set of dual tyres, as it contained a tread pattern. This one in particular, as I mentioned, were produced by a set of dual tyres because there are 2 parallel tyre marks. Now, this vehicle involved only has dual tyres on the rear axle. From that, we can deduce that that tyre mark was created by the rear tyres. Now, this...
Thank you.
Sorry?
I was just saying thank you. I think you're going to move on to the next evidence markers.
Yes, the next gouge mark is a much more angular mark. It's a nice, long, straight, deep, angular gouge mark, which is typically produced by an equally angular edge of the vehicle. Now, this mark is highlighted with a blue circle and lies between evidence markers G and D. Now, given its position on the ground relative to the marks that I believe were produced by the tyres, I deduced that this mark was most likely produced by the edge of what I might call the tray of the fire appliance as it first toppled onto its side. there's
From the offside, or that is the driver's side.
Yes, also on the driver's side. The final mark that was identified by the crime scene investigators as relevant to the rollover is the one that's highlighted with the yellow circle, which lies between evidence markers I and J. Again, another angular, straight, but however shorter gouge mark, which lies right near the top edge of what I described as the frame of the fire appliance that contains the various hoses and pumps. This was through probably the lack of other evidence, seems to be what I would consider a slow rollover event. It's not a very high speed rollover event that involves the truck sliding any distance down across the ground, as you would find in a rollover event that might occur on a highway. That where the vehicle came to rest relative to those tyre marks is very, very short. Because of that, it seems that it's flopped onto one side before completing its roll onto its roof. The photo probably doesn't depict it as well as it could, but you would find that if you rolled that truck back onto its side, it would sit neatly on those marks on the ground.
Thank you, Sergeant Fenton. In terms of tyre marks, were you able to deduce anything of significance from the tyre marks that were located in the vicinity of this particular vehicle?
Yes. Both tyre marks deviate towards the right, relative to the position of this photo specifically, and relative to the forward direction of the truck being away from where this photo is being taken.
All right, I'll see. I think there's two images that are contained within your expert report of particular tyre marks. I'll see if we can have those brought up on the screen if it assists your evidence. Your Honour, these images are found on page 271 of Exhibit 12. And we'll just have those scroll down a little further. Having some problem with the bandwidth, it seems, Your Honour. Sergeant Fenton, whilst we're trying to have those two images displayed, I'll just ask if you could just explain as best one can in the absence of those two images.
Yes, no, it's the tyre marks, both of them deviate towards the right. Now, when I say right, that is relative to the forward direction of the fire appliance. Now, these marks are very, very unusual in the regard to the direction of the vehicle rolled. Now, these marks which deviate towards the right, had this been a driving related incident, meaning that the reason for the vehicle rolling over was because it was driven too fast or steered too aggressively, they would be marks produced by a right-hand steering input. But that would then result in a left-hand rolling incident. Now, if I put it in simple terms, if you steer your car around a roundabout in a right-hand direction, you feel yourself being pushed left. That's the force involved in a rollover event. Just in a rollover event, it's much more significant. Keeping in mind that my analysis that I discussed just moments ago about the gouge marks and that, in my opinion, the vehicle rolled onto its right-hand side, these marks point in the wrong direction for that to be a driving-related incident. that if this vehicle rolled onto its right-hand side as a result of the actions of driving, those marks should deviate to the left. That this vehicle, for one reason or another, deviated to the right before toppling to the right also.
I understand. Are you able to explain, if you exclude excessive steering or speed, that is driver involvement, are you able to explain what could have caused that tangential force?
There is there are circumstances where if the topography of the land is correct, meaning that there's a steep slope that someone is attempting to drive laterally across, it is possible for the vehicle to slide or deviate towards the right before toppling to the right. Now, I don't have any data associated with the topography or the steepness, for sake of a better word.
Could I ask you just to, sorry to cut you off, could I ask you to assume that the evidence that Her Honour has received is that that general area where the vehicle had been traversing prior to the incident was a relatively neat and tidy paddock with relatively smooth topography, level ground? If you make that assumption, are you able to explain how this vehicle has rolled or at least ended up on its roof?
Well, then, that being the case, then it certainly isn't as a result of the topography of the land. That there is some other force that has pushed the vehicle towards the right that has caused it to slide some distance in the dirt, only a very short distance, as depicted in the tyre marks, before being of sufficient force to tip or topple the vehicle onto its right also. Now, as pointed out in my report, I'm aware of some very unusual climatic event and speculation of very, very strong winds that may have blown the vehicle onto its left. Any analysis or any opinion regarding that is beyond my scope of training. I'm aware of incidents where vehicles have been blown over, particularly heavy vehicles, because of the large sail type side that they have. It's not at all unheard of, but in this specific regard and how it relates to the fire incident, I can't offer any expert explanation.
Thank you. I might just see if we can have a diagram brought up onto the screen. It's a diagram that I found at page 307 of Exhibit 12. And Sergeant, I just want to ask you some questions about the mechanism of how it was that this particular heavy has landed on its roof. And it may be easier to do that by way of a diagram. So please bear with me whilst that comes up on the screen. Whilst we're waiting for that to be brought up, in summary, did you conclude that firstly, from your analysis, there was no driver input in relation to how it was that this particular vehicle ended up on its roof? That is, there was no excessive steering or speed involved?
That is correct.
Right. Secondly, that based on the assumption that I just put to you a moment ago about the topography or the ground level to which this, or surface to which this vehicle was traversing, that forms no basis as far as you're concerned that's resulted in this vehicle being tipped onto its roof?
That is correct.
And given your evidence a moment ago, based on your training and experience, you're unable to comment on the possibility of whether the vehicle was blown over by unusually strong winds?
That is correct. Other than to say that that is not unheard of. That why we have been involved in incidents where large things, including heavy vehicles, have been blown over. That is not beyond the scope of reason, but I can't say that that is what occurred.
I've been informed that we're having some IT difficulties at our end, so I'm unable to bring up that diagram. But are you able to express an opinion as to the mechanism of how it was the vehicle has ended up on its roof? For example, was it, to your understanding, tilted from the rear?
No.
And then it has, so it's been tilted and then inverted, coming down on firstly onto the driver's side first, or you're unable to comment?
The gouge marks in the photos as presented to me suggest that it tipped at the point where the wheels met the ground. That was what you might consider the pivot, and has toppled or flopped onto its driver's side, its right-hand side, before continuing to then roll onto its roof. That the idea that it might have lifted from the front,
No, from the rear.
lifted from the rear, would seem unreasonable to me, given that there are gouge marks on the ground associated with the rear of the vehicle. It would seem much more likely, as with as is the mechanism with rollovers that are driving driving input related, that the contact patch between the offside tyres and the ground is the fulcrum. That is the point at which it trips and then topples onto its side. There's no evidence available to me to suggest that there's any other explanation.
Now, I take it that in terms of the opinion you've just expressed now, that there may be some limitations inbuilt into that in circumstances where you hadn't attended the accident scene, for example?
That is correct.
Thank you. They are my questions, Sergeant.
Sergeant, there may be some questions from others. I'll just ask if you could wait there for a minute. Mr. Free.
No questions, Your Honour.
Mr. Sakalos.
No questions, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Sergeant, for your evidence today. You're excused.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Your Honour, I'm terribly sorry. Just wondering if we could have a short adjournment to sort out some IT difficulties and then also to do the testing for the next witnesses.
Yes, so just 5 minutes or so?
Maybe 10.
Maybe 10? Okay, we'll adjourn for 10 minutes.
No, please, Your Honour. Your Honour, thank you for the time. I think we've sorted out the technical problems at our end, and I understand that the next witness, Mr. Mark Scullthorpe, is in the virtual waiting room and can be called to give evidence.
Mr. Scullthorpe, can you see and hear us?
Hello, it's Mark Scullthorpe here.
Oh yes, Mr. Scullthorpe, you'll just hear from the court officer now.
Thank you.
Mr. Scullthorpe, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
The oath, please.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Mr. Scullthorpe, would you please state your full name?
My full name is Mark Scullthorpe. That's spelled Scullthorpe.
Thank you. And what is your present occupation?
I am a consultant motor vehicle crash reconstructionist and forensic investigator.
Were you, in the early part of 2020, requested by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service to undertake a forensic reconstruction investigation into a motor vehicle incident that occurred on a property known as Lightwood on the 30th of December 2019?
Yes, sir.
And as a result of that investigation, did you produce a report dated the 8th of February 2020?
Yes, I did.
Do you have a copy of your report with you today?
Yes, I do, on the desk in front of me.
Your Honour, Mr. Scullthorpe's expert report is found at page 362 of Exhibit 12. Mr. Scullthorpe, do you today adhere to the opinions that you've expressed throughout your report dated the 8th of February 2020?
Yes, I do.
Can I just ask you firstly, before we move into various aspects of your report, to set out, in general terms, your education, training, qualifications and experience in relation to forensic reconstruction investigations in relation to motor vehicles, collisions, rollovers and other incidents?
Yes, sir. I joined the New South Wales Police Force in June 1981. Began investigating motor vehicle crashes. In 1989, I joined the Police Accident Investigation Squad, as it was known then, during which time we only investigated serious and fatality motor vehicle collisions. I remained in that section until 1990, when I returned to general duties for a short time, studied and then funded my own trip over to the United States to Northwestern University, where I did courses in motor vehicle crash reconstruction. Came back with those qualifications and then commenced performing motor vehicle crash reconstruction for the New South Wales Police until my resignation from the police force in 1997, when I commenced my own private consultancy that has continued now for 24 years until today.
Thank you. In terms of the number of forensic reconstruction investigations you've carried out, are you able to approximate how many you may have done in that lengthy career you've just outlined?
No, sir, I have no idea. It would be in the thousands. As a member of the crash investigation unit, I was actually, sorry, I neglected to say that I rejoined the crash investigation unit at Hurstville in the South region when I was still a member of the police force. But during my collective time in the crash investigation unit, I attended about 400 serious and fatality motor vehicle collisions. Since then, I have attended, I couldn't tell you how many motor vehicle crash investigations I've performed, but as I said, it would be in the thousands.
Thank you. Now, as part of your investigation into this particular incident, did you attend the scene shortly after the events that unfolded on the 30th of December 2019?
Yes, indeed, I did.
And was that on or about the 3rd of January 2020?
Yes, it was. Friday, the 3rd of January, we attended.
And who else was in attendance on that occasion?
I attended there with Mr. Ken Edwards of the RFS and Mr. Angus Bullough, a fire investigator. They escorted us into the fire ground to attend the scene. So we followed basically under their escort through the active fire grounds that were still active at the time, and spent the day examining the scene of this particular event.
And on that day, the 3rd of January 2020, was the fire truck still at the scene?
Yes, indeed. We spoke, upon our arrival there at the site, we spoke to the property owner and I asked him if anybody had attended that location where the fire truck was still in situ, although it had been righted onto its wheels. The property owner said to me, no, he had closed the gate and nobody had been in or out since then. I was reasonably satisfied that the scene, this site, I should say, had remained intact, other than for the truck having been righted back onto its wheels to enable Mr. McPaul to be removed from the truck.
What about livestock? Did the owner of the property, I think it was Mr. Hicks, say to you anything about whether there'd been livestock in and about that paddock since the incident or not?
He said that there had not been any livestock in that paddock. I'm not certain if there were any in there at the time of the event, and he had since removed them, but he did say that he had not allowed any livestock into that paddock since the event, no.
Now, in terms of methodology, what methodology did you employ at the scene to go about your undertaking in respect of a reconstruction investigation?
Well, predominantly because the methods that I employ are based upon correct interpretation of physical evidence. Well, interpretation of physical evidence, as it were, whether it's correct or not is certainly up to the judicial system to decide. But we drove in through the gate and parked our vehicle some distance back from the area where the truck was in an open clearing part of the paddock. We were very conscious of not contaminating any tyre marks or any other aspects of physical evidence. There were some tyre marks in and around the truck that were, I would describe as track marks, that after the fire had swept through the area, there was a large amount of cinders and ash and burnt vegetable material, as in grass. So any vehicle movement through that area would most certainly leave track marks. So we stopped some distance short of the site and we inspected it on foot very carefully to try and determine the area where the physical evidence may have been located. So we were careful to try and not contaminate any of it that had remained. So,
and in terms of physical evidence, did you ascertain that there were particular features of some types of physical evidence that were important to your investigation, such as vehicle damage, tyre marks, and debris and the like?
Yes, indeed. There were.
If we just deal with some of those in turn, in relation to vehicle damage, and if you need to highlight any particular features by reference to a photographic image, please let her Honour know. Could we just start firstly with the vehicle damage, and what, if any, particular features of that damage to the vehicle were important to your analysis in relation to the mechanism of this incident?
Okay, one of the first things I noticed as I approached the immediate area was that it was clear to see that at some point the vehicle had been inverted on its roof. But one of the major points was that the roof was crushed more so along the passenger's side of the vehicle, if you like. I refer to it, the near side is the passenger side and the off side is the driver's side. But for ease of reference, I'll just refer to it as passenger side versus driver's side. That
pausing there.
Certainly.
Sorry to cut you off. To assist you with your evidence, would photograph 8, if that was brought up, which is on page 371 of Exhibit 12, would photograph 8 assist you in the giving of your evidence in relation to vehicle damage?
If you can bear with me, now, is that photograph, is that one of my photos in my report or one in the ICAM report?
It's photograph 8 within your report, and if it is, I think it's page 10 of your report, but we're working off slightly different numbers here in the court. It's 371 in our bundle. And I'll endeavour to refer to your photographs contained within your report. I don't know whether we can magnify that a little. Now, you were saying before I cut you off, Mr. Scullthorpe, about there being more damage to the offside or passenger side.
Yes, the passenger side is the near side. I can see on the screen you have my photograph 8. If I could take the court back to photograph 7 on the previous page, I think that provides a better impression of the extent of damage to the passenger side of the truck.
We'll bring that up shortly.
Certainly. And for anybody referring to these images not digitally in hard copy, photograph 1 in my report also provides I think, a better view of the nature of the greater crush on the passenger side of the truck. Okay, I can see on the screen now from my photograph 7, you can see from that the roof is crushed more so on the passenger side of the cabin, that the distortion commences indeed at the base of the rear door window, where the pillars extend from the base of the window up toward the roof. So in a normal rollover event, the side of the vehicle that first contacts the ground is normally the side that suffers the greatest crush. So if you were sitting in the driver's seat of a vehicle and it rolled over toward its driver's side, let's say in an anti-clockwise direction, if you're sitting in the driver's seat and imagine that the vehicle's going to roll, looking forward from the driver's seat, if it rolls in that anti-clockwise direction onto its driver's side first, it's that side of the roof that is going to generally sustain the greatest crush. But one of the earliest factors or features of this vehicle damage that I observed was that although the vehicle was said to have rolled over in that right-hand side, it would have been the driver's side that would have suffered the greatest amount of crush. So it struck me pretty well straight away that it didn't make sense, that the way in which the vehicle had interacted with the ground ought to have created greater crush on the driver's side. So that was the first issue that struck me during my initial stage of my investigation. So I just put that issue aside just for the moment, and
we'll come back to that as we proceed through. But it's an important feature that, as I understand, features in terms of how you arrived at your ultimate conclusion as to the mechanism of this incident. Are there any other features of the physical evidence in relation to vehicle damage that you wish to touch upon before we move into perhaps the rear tyre marks and the significance of some of those that were observed at the scene?
Yes, indeed. The next, we're probably jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll just make a preliminary comment in relation to damaged scars on the truck's front bull bar. Now, the lights have just gone off in this building. I'm not sure. Can you still hear me okay?
We can. You might need to move around. There may be a sensor that...
Oh, the sensor. Okay. Oh, that's right. I'm happy to sit in the dark. I can see the screen better.
I must say, if you could move around and reactivate the lights, it would be better for those who are viewing, including Her Honour, no doubt. That's better. Thank you. Sorry. I apologise. There were other aspects of physical evidence on the truck, yes, that were quite important to me, and that is that the bull bar displayed areas of dirt where it had gouged out dirt out of the ground, and those areas where the dirt had remained on the bull bar would not normally have contacted with the ground if the truck had simply rolled over. Corresponding with those areas of the scrapes and paint removal on the bull bar, I located corresponding red colour transfer within gouges in the ground. So that red colour transfer was consistent between the gouges in the ground and the scrapes on the bull bar to indicate to me that... Pausing there, sorry to interrupt. Again, it may assist those following if we bring up onto the screen a photograph of that particular bull bar. Does photograph 32 within your report, Mr. Scullthorpe, adequately portray the scrapes and striations?
Yes,
or not?
Indeed. Yes, indeed.
I'll endeavour to have photograph 32 displayed. And do I understand your evidence that the scrapes that one will see in photograph 32 corresponded with paint transfer within the ground adjacent to where you deduced the bull bar may have contacted the ground?
Indeed.
Right, now, you mentioned that there was scrapes. Do we see those running down the edge of the front bull bar where there's clear scuff marks, some striations, it seems?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
And you mentioned something about dirt in and around that front part of the vehicle toward the bar. What was the significance of the dirt?
That the dirt had been snared, if you like, in different parts of the truck because those parts of the truck had physically contacted with the ground. It was like they had been, well, they had in fact had been pressed into various parts of the truck, folds in the metal, the rear view mirror body, and also there's from my memory there was a area of dirt wedged into the one of the parts of the frame of the bull bar itself. Photograph 8 of my report shows a large amount of dirt that had been pressed hard against the driver's external rear view mirror. So
I'll try and have photograph 8 displayed.
and
It
also
does take a little
photograph
bit of
9.
time.
Yes, that's okay. So photographs 8 and
Now,
9.
Thank you. Does that demonstrate, for your purposes, Mr. Scullthorpe, the compacted dirt on the side view mirror on the driver's side of the vehicle?
Yes, it does.
And we'll go now to photograph 9, which I understand is another view of the driver's side front that shows firstly that it remained largely intact, but also the dirt that you've referred to in your evidence.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I did cut you off to display photograph 32.
Yes.
I apprehend that you may have been moving into another area in relation to physical evidence consistent with why it was you reached a particular view as to the mechanism of this incident.
Yes. The striations shown in photograph 32, striations is just a fancy word for angled scrapes or scratches. But those striations display oblique orientation at an approximate 45-degree angle across the side of that bull bar to show that when physical contact occurred between that part of the bull bar frame, yes, that's I can see the image now, you have it on the screen in front. When movement occurred, that part of the vehicle was moving at an angle across the ground, that it was moving either forward or rearward, but also sideways at the same time. That could be consistent with a pivoting movement of the truck, as that particular part of the bull bar was in contact with the ground.
Thank you.
Sorry?
Sorry, you were going to say something before I interrupted.
Yes. When I saw that, I knew that something physical had caused those damage features, and that I later, whilst examining the gouges in the ground, revealed those aspects of red colour transfer within the gouges themselves that are shown in photographs 28, 29, 30 and 31 of my report.
All right, we'll have those displayed. How do you explain the bull bar contacting with the ground and leaving those paint transference in the gouge marks? What sort of mechanism, in your opinion, resulted in that?
To put those aspects of physical evidence together, the only explanation in my mind is that the truck, the rear of the truck, had been lifted off the ground. that to the point where the bull bar had come into contact with the ground as the truck effectively pivoted on its front.
On more on the driver's side or more on the passenger side, or are you unable to say?
Initially, I believe the passenger side, and then subsequently the driver's side. And part of my reason for that opinion also has everything to do with the tyre marks that the truck had created immediately before those features had been created.
Now, in relation to the tyre marks, you deal with that initially on page 375 of Exhibit 12, page 14 of your report. And
Yes.
were there a number of features, in your opinion, produced by those tyre marks that was consistent with your working theory that the rear of the motor vehicle had been lifted as part of the rollover incident?
Absolutely.
And what are those particular features that are consistent with that theory?
I found 2 sets of dual tyre mark on the ground. One set was more prominent than the other, but they were both visible on the ground. They were both quite relatively short. The tyre marks created by the truck's passenger side rear dual set initially commenced as what you would call a cleansing mark, where a brake application by the truck driver had initiated the retarding force between the tyre and the ground. So what had happened was that the truck was moving forward. The driver applied the brakes. Now, the initial brake application produced a retarding effect, obviously, of the brakes through the wheels and the tyres, where those tyre marks were, in fact, what we call track marks. Now, a track mark will produce an imprint of a tyre tread pattern on the surface. And it can happen in circumstances where there is no braking. But in this case, there was indeed braking, because the initial section of both sets of curved rear dual tyre marks displayed that imprint of the tread pattern. Not only the imprint of the tread pattern, but there was also a dark colour transfer, which is indeed consistent with rubber material transfer onto the ground. So that indicated that the initial track mark quickly developed into the commencement of a skid mark, where the black material was left deposited on the ground, and then developed further into what we call a skid mark, which is where the tyre actually stops rotating because of the brake effort being applied. And the contact patch of the tyre actually commenced to slide and to skid across the surface. Now,
and that was, just to jump in if I may, and from your analysis, that was for a very short distance, perhaps in the order of 6 inches or 150 millimetres?
Correct. The actual skid mark was only very, very short. Then it came to an abrupt halt. The skid mark was at the termination of the skid mark. From that point further forward, in terms of the direction of the truck's movement, there were no more tyre marks. So that was the case for the near side. It was also the case for the offside, the driver's side, because they too ended as abruptly as the near side or the passenger side dual tyre marks did. There wasn't as much detail within the dual tyre marks created by the driver's side rear tyres, probably because at that point, the truck had started to tilt toward its passenger side, toward its left. So the weight had started to lift off the rear driver's side tyres, be transferred onto the passenger side. Now, advancing forward, at the same time when these marks were being created, there was the wheelbase further forward. And if I could just quickly explain, wheelbase of a vehicle is the distance between the front axle and the rear axle. A vehicle's wheel track is the distance between the left tyres and the right tyres. So during my examination of the site, about the wheelbase further forward of where the rear tyre marks ceased was another curved mark in the dirt that had already commenced as a very thin, almost scalloped shape mark that quickly developed into what we call a critical curve tyre mark, where the tyre of its origin was being turned to the right, and the tyre that began to create the long thin mark had started to side slip on the dirt, on the ground. There was black colour transfer at the commencement of that tyre mark, which is consistent with the black rubber material of the tyre. But that tyre mark quickly developed into, it became wider, and it developed into a heavy, almost a sideways scrub of that tyre as it began to slide sideways across the dirt. Now, the practical application of a sideways effect, the sideways force, I believe was due to the driver applying right-hand steering input at that point. As though
together with braking?
As well as braking at the same time, because he had the combination of the tyre mark at the front caused by the front passenger's tyre that was also curved toward the right, and the rear tyre marks as well. The combination of all of those indicated that the driver had applied a heavy brake application and had applied right-hand steering input at the same time. Now, if, for instance, the truck was being driven at a speed and a heavy right-hand steering input was applied, if the speed and the combination of the speed and the attempted curved path to the right was sufficient, forces would have gone beyond the truck's rollover threshold, if you like, which is that point at which a vehicle will begin to roll over. And in ordinary circumstances, the physical evidence would indicate the truck ought to have rolled onto its left-hand side if its movement had gone beyond its rollover threshold. But when we take the rear tyre marks, the front tyre mark, and we consider them in conjunction with the red colour transfer and the scrapes on the front bull bar, they all indicated to me that the truck had, the rear tyres had been lifted off the ground, that to the point where they were lifted to a height that was sufficient to have allowed the truck's bull bar on the front of the truck to come down into contact with the ground. where it left the red colour transfer as it contacted with the ground and ended up from that point on somehow ended up being dumped upside down. So
I might just have, just pausing there, given the description you've just given in relation to the mechanism, I might have displayed a diagram and just to make sure that we're all on the same page. It's 307 of Exhibit 12. You may not have seen this diagram previously, Mr. Scullthorpe. Whilst that's coming up, are you able to proffer any explanation as to why a fire truck would be, in effect, commencing an evasive tactic by right-hand steering input and significant service brake application in an open paddock?
All I could imagine was that for some reason the driver had commenced evasive tactics to avoid impact with something approaching him from the front and from his left-hand side. Because the brake application, the right-hand steer application are consistent with that evasive tactic to avoid something approaching him from that direction, from the front left.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, we have on screen a diagram. Does that adequately portray your thesis as to the mechanism of how the truck came to be inverted by the lifting of the rear wheels,
yes,
firstly?
Yes. In a word, yes. That was the height to which the rear of the truck had at least been lifted. Now,
and is that height about? Sorry to cut you off.
Yes.
Is that height in the order of about 3.2 metres from the ground?
Yes, indeed.
And then once it's lifted to that approximate height, in terms of the physics, what then, in your opinion, is likely to have occurred?
Vehicle rotation, because of the curved nature of the gouges in the ground that contained the red colour transfer, which I believe came from the front bull bar. So I would say the extent of rotation, I don't know. The height to which the vehicle's rear was lifted certainly would have at least been 3.2 metres, but it may have been higher. I don't know. All I can say is that if you were to assume that illustration you have on screen now is a minimum height the rear of the vehicle was lifted, it then from that point on had pivoted on its front and somehow, whilst pivoting on its front, rotated to the point where it was dumped on its roof with the passenger side more heavily landing on the ground than the driver's side. So if you were to imagine that illustration on screen now and imagine that the rear of the truck is lifted probably higher than that, it then does what we could probably call a pirouette as it rotates on its front, or partially on its front bull bar, and then rotates to the point where by the time the vehicle had been released to then land down onto the ground, the passenger side had rotated up over the driver's side, and then the passenger side was presented to the ground more heavily than the driver's side.
Importantly, Mr. Scullthorpe, what, in your opinion, caused the rear of that truck to be lifted such that it's enabled the vehicle to be rotated, thus eventually landing on its roof?
All I can say to answer that question is an incredible force that lifted it and spun it on its front. An incredible force that I have never witnessed in all my years of this line of work.
I take it from that last response, you've not ever encountered a vehicle, or indeed a heavy vehicle, that has been uplifted and inverted that has not involved significant speed, braking or topography?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Given that answer, I take it you exclude any involvement of the driver in relation to how it was this particular vehicle landed on its roof?
His involvement, in my opinion, was none whatsoever. I don't believe, looking at the forces required to move the vehicle in the way indicated by all the aspects of physical evidence, I don't believe there was anything that gentleman could have done to have prevented any of this.
Now, this particular vehicle was in the order of perhaps 10 to 15 tonnes, depending on the weight of particular appliances and how much water was in the tank.
Yes.
But if you assume a weight of 10 tonnes at the minimum end of the scale, are you able to express a view as to the type of force that may have been applied to firstly to lift it, pivot it, rotate it such that it lands on its roof, or not?
No, I can't.
In terms of other physical evidence that is consistent with significant wind or forces being applied in that general area, did you make some observations in relation to the vehicle's windscreen?
Yes, indeed, I did.
And particularly, of particular note, what was it about the windscreen and parts of the windscreen that you were able to locate that was consistent with a significant force being applied to this vehicle as part of the incident?
Well, not only had the windscreen, well, at first, I was a little bit gobsmacked, if you like. I was looking for the windscreen. I only found part of it initially. And generally speaking, vehicle rollovers, if the windscreen isn't actually ejected out of its frame in the vehicle because the roof is distorted, it's quite often smashed, but it's normally located somewhere near the vehicle, but in an intact condition. Truck windscreens, of course, are quite large and physically quite heavy. This particular windscreen had been torn into, I don't know how many pieces, and it had been strewn over an area of at least 75 metres through the paddock and through the adjoining paddock on the other side of the property driveway. I don't know how much force in terms of Newton meters would be required to do that to a vehicle windscreen, but it again was something that I've never witnessed before, because there were small pieces of that windscreen that had just been distributed over a long distance. If the windscreen had been flung but had remained intact, I could understand that. But it had actually been torn apart, which for anybody who may not know too much about laminated windscreens, they're constructed with two sheets of glass, safety glass, that is sandwiched between a sheet of polymer, which is a strong plastic. So in the event that the windscreen's actually fractured, the sheet of plastic between the glass laminates holds it together so as it doesn't become what used to be known as the glass circle or the glass necklace. So it protects people from more serious lacerations. But that sheet of plastic between the glass laminates is quite strong. It's quite tough. And it takes a strong force to puncture it. And I've never seen a windscreen torn into pieces like this, ever.
Thank you. Just finally, consistent with the theory you've expressed today and within your report, did you locate the vehicle's emergency lamps or light bar?
Yes, I did.
Some distance from where the truck has ultimately ended up?
Yes, I did.
And from your analysis of the vehicle's emergency lamps or its light bar, was that similar to the observations you made in relation to the windscreen, that a significant force may have been applied to this vehicle to remove the lamps, and in this particular case, the lamps were found some distance from the truck?
Yes, one of the lamp bodies was intact, as in it had not been crushed, whereas the other one had been flattened. I formed the view from the damage to the truck that one of them was on the roof of the truck when it was inverted and dumped onto its roof on the ground. But somehow they've both then been propelled at some velocity across the dirt, across the paddock toward the road, after they had separated from the truck at some point.
Can I ask you, please, Mr. Scullthorpe, to go to paragraph 4.10, page 54 of your report. It's page 415 of Exhibit 12.
Yes.
Now, there's a figure 4. I'll just see if we can have the figure 4 brought up on the screen. Were you able to hear the evidence of Sergeant Fenton this morning?
Yes, sir, I was. Yes, I was.
I just want to deal with one aspect of Sergeant Fenton's evidence relating to his opinion in relation to the mechanism that may have caused the rollover. Do I understand correctly that you don't agree with that aspect of Sergeant Fenton's evidence as to the mechanism, that is how the vehicle ended up on its roof?
No, I do not.
And at the risk of going over some of the evidence you've already given this morning, could you just explain why you don't agree with that aspect of Sergeant Fenton's evidence in relation to the mechanism?
Indeed. In fairness to Sergeant Fenton, I understand he did not attend the scene or the site of this event.
That's correct.
Okay, so he wasn't able to record his own measurements of various aspects of physical evidence, whereas I was. I don't know if Sergeant Fenton had been provided with measurements of the scene recorded by Forensic Services Police, or even if those measurements were in fact recorded in the first instance. But there was physically insufficient distance between the tyre mark, the rear tyre marks created by the truck immediately before its rear was lifted off the ground, and between that point and between where the truck ultimately was inverted and dumped onto its roof, that in taking you to my figure 4 that's on the screen now, if we work backward from the truck's position when I attended the site after it had been righted back onto its wheels, I was told, and again, physical evidence confirmed this too, that if you were to unwind the event, as it were, back to where the truck was when this event happened to where it came to rest. That illustration I've got a red rectangle beside the truck whilst the truck's in its proper position on its wheels. So if you were to roll the truck onto its passenger side, you would then move the truck to that first rectangle beside the truck that I've titled lying on its passenger side. If you were then to roll the truck from its passenger side back onto its roof to where it was upside down, the truck would then move backward to the position I've titled with the dark, the burgundy, if you like, rectangle that is titled upside down with the dual tyres showing. So you can assume that in that position, the truck would have been upside down. Again, all of this explanation is to discount a simple rollover event. So we've rotated the truck from its wheels onto its passenger side, onto its roof, and then if you were then to roll it back, continue back to lying on its driver's side, you get to the rectangle, the red rectangle in the right-hand side of that image. That represents the truck's approximate position when it would have been lying on its driver's side. Now, in that position, its rear tyres would not have been in contact with the ground. But you'll see that I have highlighted the truck's actual dual rear tyre marks with the black arrows with the words pre-rollover rear tyre marks. Now, that we know that is where the truck was when it created its rear tyre marks. So if it was to simply roll over onto its driver's side, then onto its roof and passenger side, there was not sufficient distance between those locations to have allowed that to happen. All of that was entirely consistent with my theory, my explanation that the rear of the truck had been lifted and the truck had pivoted, almost pirouetted on its front before it was then dumped upside down onto the ground.
Thank you for that explanation. And just to assist with that last passage of your evidence, I'll just have brought up figure 5, which is the next figure in your expert report, Mr. Scullthorpe, which identifies where the pre-rollover rear dual tyre marks were positioned, as well as the front tyre mark.
Yes.
Apart from that disagreement with Sergeant Fenton in relation to the mechanism of the rollover, do I understand correctly that both yourself and Sergeant Fenton are in furious agreement that the result of the rollover had nothing to do with driver input, whether it be excessive steering, speed or braking?
Yes, indeed, we concur on that, and that is something I have never been surer of.
Thank you. They are my questions, Mr. Scullthorpe.
Thank you.
Mr. Scullthorpe, I'll just see if there's any other questions for you, if you wouldn't mind waiting.
Thank you, Your
Mr.
Honour.
Free.
No questions, Your Honour. Thank you.
Mr. Sapalos.
No questions, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Mr. Scullthorpe. You are excused.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Your Honour, if it's convenient, could we take the morning adjournment?
Certainly. We'll resume at 12:10.
Please, the Court.
Coroners Court has resumed.
Your Honour, the next witness is Mr Edwards, who I understand is in the virtual waiting room and can be brought in to be sworn.
Mr Edwards, can you see and hear us?
Yes, Your Honour.
You'll just hear from the court officer now.
Mr Edwards, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath for the affirmation?
The oath will be fine, thank you.
Silence, please. Do you swear by Almighty God that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Mr Edwards, would you please state your full name?
Kenneth Andrew Edwards.
And what is your present occupation?
I'm the safety supervisor for the New South Wales RFS.
And as the safety supervisor for the RFS, do you sit within the New South Wales RFS Health, Safety and Welfare section?
Yes, it was at the time of this incident, it was the Health, Safety and Welfare unit, and we're soon to be the safety unit.
Thank you. And if you don't mind me asking, Mr Edwards, could you just set out your experience in matters pertaining to safety in the workplace?
Yeah, probably primarily I started in the police force, New South Wales Police Force in 1985. I spent 27 years as a general duties police officer, maturing to the rank of acting inspector. After that, in 2012, I obtained my work health and safety advanced diploma, and I branched out into safety. I worked in heavy plant for Hastings Deering in Queensland for 2 to 3 years. And then I was a safety supervisor in mining, George Fisher Mine in the northwest of Queensland, before coming to the RFS in 2017. I've also undertaken the incident cause analysis methodology course to undertake investigations into safety incidents. And I've conducted several safety incidents in mining, obviously emergency services such as the RFS, and also in heavy plant.
Thank you. Were you in 2020, or perhaps, yes, in 2020, tasked with undertaking an investigation in relation to 3 incidents that occurred in the Jinjallik area on the 30th of December 2019?
Yes, that's correct.
And as a result of your investigation, have you produced a Level 3 ICAM investigation report dated the 11th of November 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
And does ICAM stand for Incident Cause Analysis Method?
Yes, that's correct.
And it's a Level 3 investigation report. What does Level 3 denote, Mr. Edwards?
Level 3 within this organisation and other organisations number their triggers differently, but a Level 3 is the most serious incident, which would involve obviously a fatal incident or a potentially fatal incident.
Now, of the 3 incidents, one related, did it not, to an RFS fire truck that was overturned in a paddock within the Lightwood property, Jinjallik, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The incident involving the death of Sam McPaul.
Now, very briefly, there were 2 other incidents. Did one of the other 2 also involve a rollover on the 30th of December 2012?
Yeah, there was an incident on the River Road. Group captain Ian Avage, his vehicle was blown off the side of the road, and it rolled against a post. It wasn't a full rollover, but it did roll against a post.
And just in relation to Mr. Avage's incident, which is incident number 3 within your report, did you come to the conclusion that that was more likely than not caused by severe wind as a result of a fire-generated vortex?
I did, yes.
Now, in relation to the incident involving Samuel McPaul, can I just ask you to set out for Her Honour's benefit, what are some of the safety features within that fire truck for crew who are on the back of the truck? So particularly focusing on the crew refuge area or the crew protection area.
Yeah, there is a crew refuge area. It's got substantial heat protection around it. Obviously, this is the area where grass fires are often fought. The actual height of that crew protection area, which is colloquially known as a pig pen, is 900 millimetres high, so there's sufficient restraint, obviously, for normal vehicle movements, and that's the primary purpose of it. There is also a on the rear headboard of the truck, there is a roll bar built into that that will also somewhat protect the rear of the cabin and the rear of the truck.
Is there water protection where hoses can be activated to provide additional cover or not?
I think in this case, and I'm not sure on this specific vehicle, but we do have what they call as a halo system, but I don't believe this truck was fitted with a halo system. However, it was probably fitted with wheel sprays, which would protect the wheels from an emerging fire.
Now, in terms of personal protective equipment, did you come to the conclusion that each of the crew on Culcan NW2 Alpha were appropriately equipped with PPE?
Yes, there certainly was all the PPE there. Probably with the exception, and I think the firefighters did describe to me that they hadn't put on what's called the flash hood, which is protection around the neck and alike. But given the temperatures at the time, which were, I'm led to believe, in excess of 40 degrees, and given also that they weren't, at the time, they didn't anticipate to be in close quarters with the fire, it wouldn't be unusual that they didn't have that on. But I'm led to believe that they were wearing all their other PPC, their helmet, their jacket, and their pants, which are all treated with obviously a heat-resistant capability.
Thank you. Now, in terms of one minor aspect of your report, you've got your report handy, do you?
I do, yes.
And there's I can just take you into, pardon me a moment.
I'm fortunate to have your page numbering as well, if that assists.
Thank you. That does assist. There's just one minor aspect I wanted to clarify with you in relation to your instructions when you came to prepare this report. It's 310, page 310, Mr. Edwards, 12. It's that section that relates to organisational factors, section 2.5. At about point 8 of the page, you state Andrew Goody and several other firefighters on the ground recall hearing the message, that's the emergency weather warning message, and responded their acknowledgement via radio. How did you come to make that assumption or obtain that evidence in relation to Mr. Goody hearing that emergency weather warning number 1, which is immediately above that passage?
Yeah, I believe I had a conversation with him. However, I would concede that you know, there was obviously a lot of evidence I collected in those days, and that may well be my error. It certainly was. Ian Abbage did mention that he'd heard it, and I thought I'd spoken to Andrew about that, and he had told me that he had. So, although I didn't record that in his statement.
Thank you. I was going to take you to his statement, and it didn't seem to appear in his statement. And his evidence yesterday, in fairness to you, was that he did not recall hearing that particular message, and proffered the explanation that it may have been when he was out of the truck kitting up before they attended asset protection at Lightwood.
Yeah, and I could well have erred in that aspect.
Now, in terms of these three incidents, and if I can take you to page 294, and again, I'll see if we can bring it up onto the screen. At the top of page 294, there's a satellite image of the general area in that Gengelic area, and you've marked on that satellite image where the fire truck Colcan NW2 Alpha was located in situ on its roof. And then in relation to the two other incidents which you've addressed in your report, Group 4 Isuzu is Mr. Avage's vehicle, is it not?
That's correct.
And then Back Creek 2, there was an incident involving Stuart Anderson and Andrew Julian.
That's correct.
Were you able to, based on the location of each of those three incidents, to form a view as to the path of travel this particular fire-generated vortex may have taken?
Not really. I'm not expert in matters as far as the actual fire-generated vortices is concerned. However, I'm led to believe that whether there was multiple vortices or whether there was one large vortice or whether it was the travel of those vortices, I couldn't say.
You're able to plot the distance between where Mr. Anderson and Mr. Julian were vis-a-vis Colcan Northwest 2 Alpha was about 2.3 kilometres as the crow flies?
That's correct, yes.
Now, in terms of communications, which we touched upon a moment ago, when there's an emergency weather warning broadcast from fire control to crew on the ground, if they're not in a cabin with a PMR radio, by what other means can that emergency weather warning be brought to their attention?
That would be the only way, unless there was some communication between people on the fire ground radio.
And in relation to that, do I understand correctly that individual firefighters are unlikely to carry with them a portable radio that can patch back into the FireCom system coming out of fire control?
Yes, that's correct.
On the ground, from your experience as a safety officer within New South Wales RFS, on the ground may have a portable radio, generally speaking.
So a safety officer on the ground would have a radio, are you suggesting, or?
No, I'm just trying to understand that in a typical scenario where there's RFS crew on the ground attending to a fire, typically is there any individual person that may have a portable radio that can have communications with fire control, that is the incident controller at fire control within the IMT?
Yes, that would be correct.
And who are those people who may have a portable radio in the field, generally speaking?
Generally, usually your group captains will have a radio, and also like crew leaders on the ground. Some individual firefighters may have radios.
Thank you.
But it wouldn't commonly be the practice. the persons in the back of a truck would have a radio.
Now, in terms of the prediction of a fire-generated vortex, is it your understanding that there is no predictive tool that could forecast the likely event of a fire-generated vortex?
I'm advised by the experts in these matters that that's the case, that there are several contributing factors and there are some indicators, but specifically there's no way to understand whether it's going to become an FGV event or whether it's or where that FG event might be.
And given that last answer, Mr. Edwards, does that explain perhaps somewhat why it was that some of the crew that were involved in the three incidents that you investigated did not have particular PPE, that is the fire hood that you referred to earlier, because they just did not know, or that is, they were unaware that there was likely to be a fire-generated vortex coming through at that moment in time?
Oh, that's certainly correct. That they wouldn't have had. I think even if they had heard the emergency weather warning, they wouldn't have perceived the magnitude, certainly, that this incident caused.
The final topic I wish to ask you some questions about relates to escape routes and evacuation planning. Did you, as part of your review, look at the escape routes in relation to that area around Jingellic?
Yeah, Ian Avage had distributed his crews along the River Road. He had established and identified an escape route, which was at 499, I believe, on River Road, which is actually the home of the Jingellic captain, Albie Morass. The area there had a good escape route and refuge, if you will,
Yes,
along the river, which had appropriate water and those sorts of things, and was relatively clear of any vegetation that might catch fire. I believe that he had the opportunity to communicate that with the crew of Northwest Colcan, as he was going to see them, I believe, at the time when he was blown off the road.
And from your review, were you satisfied that that escape route was an adequate route given the prevailing circumstances on that day?
Yeah, certainly if it had been a conventional fire, it was a prudent choice for a refuge.
Now, in terms of Colcan Northwest 2 Alpha, again, from your experience in relation to matters pertaining to safety, the area that they were in, that is an open paddock, firstly, which you know about, can I ask you to assume that at the time, the pasture there may have been cut for hay, that the fuel load in that open paddock has been described as low. Was that a safe place to be, absent a fire-generated vortex, in the circumstances of firefighting?
In the absence of a fire-generated vortex, yeah, it was completely prudent to be in that paddock. It was flat. There was no great deviations in the surface. It probably had a fall of less than 1 in 500, I would suggest. So it had minimal fall, and it would have been a simple area to navigate a vehicle, a substantial vehicle, as Northwest 2 was, around without any compromising the vehicle or certainly the occupants in the rear.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Edwards. There may be some other questions, so please bear with us for a moment.
Mr. Free.
No questions, Your Honour.
Mr. Sakalos.
No questions, Your Honour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. You're excused.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Your Honour, the next witness is Dr. Peace from the Bureau of Meteorology. I'm told that Dr. Peace is available and can be brought into the virtual courtroom shortly.
Dr. Peace, can you see and hear us yet?
My apologies, Your Honour. The morning adjournment, we had done the testing and I was rather hopeful she was in the waiting room. Dr. Peace, can you hear me? Dr. Peace, can you hear me? Dr. Peace, we can't hear you, nor can we see you.
Ah, there.
Dr. Peace, we can see that you've joined, but we cannot hear or see you other than the icon that indicates that you've joined. Are you on mute by any chance, or is your video disabled? I'm instructed that Dr. Peace's audio settings are not working. Perhaps we can take a short adjournment. I'm terribly sorry, Your Honour.
Let's take a very short adjournment.
Thank you, Your Honour. If Dr. Peace could be sworn, please.
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Peace, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
Affirmation, please.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Dr. Peace, would you please state your full name?
Dr. Marika Peace.
And are you a senior research scientist with the Bureau of Meteorology?
Yes.
Have you provided to my instructing solicitors a copy of your curriculum vitae?
Yes, I have.
Your Honour, I tender Dr. Peace's curriculum vitae. It will become tab 48A. That is a new tab, 48 capital A, within Exhibit 11 capital A.
Yes, thank you.
Very briefly, Dr. Peace, could you just set out some of your education, qualifications and training in relation to the role that you fulfil within the Bureau of Meteorology?
Yeah, I joined the Bureau in 2002 and did the grad dip of meteorology program. I worked as a forecaster in operational forecasting around the country for about the first 10 years of my career. And then in 2010, I went back and completed a PhD in applied mathematics in fire and atmosphere interactions, specifically looking at interactions between fire and meteorology. And I've been with the research group since 2015 onwards, working in the high impact weather section. I work in operations as well. So for most of the 2019-2025 season, I was in the state operations centres in various fire agencies around the country. So I was in QFES on 2 occasions. I spent most of December and January working inside the State Operations Centre in RFS. And I also worked in operations here in South Australia in CFS as well. And then last year, I was on the Bureau team assembling all the material for the Royal Commission and various state inquiries. But a lot of my research work is doing case studies of fires where unusual fire behaviour occurred, so trying to unpack the reasons. And we run a high-resolution coupled fire atmosphere model as part of the research that we do.
Thank you. And as part of your role as a senior research scientist within the Bureau of Meteorology, were you requested to produce a report for the New South Wales Rural Fire Service in relation to the meteorological conditions and fire weather interaction processes that caused very destructive winds at the Green Valley Talmalmo bushfire on 30 December 2019?
Yes, I worked with Barry Handstrom on that report as part of the work, not as senior research scientist, but as part of the work that we did for the Royal Commission and the state inquiries last year.
And is that a report dated the 14th of October 2020?
Yes, so there were 2 reports that we produced. There was a longer report for the RFS, and then there was a slightly shorter summary report for the Coronial. So there were 2 separate reports that we provided.
Thank you. In relation to the longer report, Your Honour, that's found at tab 46 of Exhibit 11A, commencing at page 703, and the shorter report, which was for the benefit of Your Honour, is found behind tab 48 of Exhibit 11A, commencing at page 736. Dr. Peace, I'll work off the longer report, which is the report produced for the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. Can I just ask you to outline in summary terms what the weather conditions were like in that southern part of New South Wales leading into late December 2019, and whether there were any particular attributes that were conducive to bushfire?
Yeah, well, obviously around the country, we were looking at a really bad fire season from the middle of the year. Going into the December period, there was a sudden stratospheric warming event, which was in partly responsible for producing a series of heat waves over large areas of Australia through to December. And going into the 30th and 31st of December, there was extreme heatwave conditions over southeastern New South Wales. On the 31st of December, there was a wind change, which is typically associated with some of our most extreme fire weather conditions because the flank of the active fire can change. But in the longer leading to that period, there's been extensive drought over large parts of southeastern Australia and eastern Australia, and that drought was a really contributing factor to the dryness of fuels. So we saw much more flammable fuels across large areas of the landscape than what would normally be expected through December.
Thank you. Now, in terms of environmental conditions, were there a series of lightning strikes in that southeastern section of New South Wales around about the 27th of December to the 30th of December 2019?
Yep, there were a number of lightning events through the December period. It's not unusual to see thunderstorm activity, but what we did see in that season was an unusual degree of what we call dry lightning strikes. So instead of a thunderstorm where you've got significant rainfall, and we use a threshold of about 2 millimetres for that, most of the strikes that were seen through that period were what we'd call dry strikes, so no significant rainfall, which increases the chances of seeing fire ignition because obviously there's no rainfall to extinguish a fire. And my understanding is that there was lightning reported just upstream of Green Valley, and that was the lightning strikes responsible for the ignition of the fire on the 29th.
Now, if we just now focus on the third, either the 29th and the 30th of December 2019, were there any particular weather conditions that were conducive to creating either a pyrocumulus cloud or a pyrocumulus nimbus cloud?
Yeah, on the 29th, I don't believe so. Going into the 30th of December, the atmosphere became more unstable, and there was certainly pyrocumulonimbus that was developed and observed over the Malakuta fire in Victoria. Going into the overnight period for the 30th and the 31st, there was lightning strikes associated with the Badger fire, and that was observed on the Nowra, the pyrocumulonimbus was observed on the Nowra radar. But one of the key points that we looked at in the report was whether or not there was pyrocumulonimbus over the Green Valley fire. And from the detailed analysis that we did, which was confirmed by external sources, there was no lightning strikes over the Green Valley fire. And from the radar investigations, this cloud didn't reach a sufficient depth to be categorised as a pyrocumulonimbus cloud. So yes, there was deep pyrocumulus cloud, which developed pretty rapidly in the afternoon, and we could see that on both the radar and the satellite observations, but there were no lightning strikes associated with the Green Valley fire, so it doesn't categorise as a fire-generated thunderstorm or a pyrocumulonimbus.
And for the uninitiated, in lay terms, what's the difference between a pyrocumulus event vis-a-vis a pyrocumulus nimbus, which can create lightning?
Yeah, so we often see pyrocumulus develop over a fire. You can see pyrocumulus develop over a small fire. It happens over prescribed burns. It happens over small fires where you start to see small puffy bits of cloud developing on top of the smoke plume. In a sufficiently unstable atmosphere and typically associated with a fire that's running in really heavy fuels where you've got really high energy release, you can get sufficient energy released by the fire in an unstable atmosphere to produce a fire-generated thunderstorm or a pyrocumulonimbus event. So there are two thresholds that we use to determine whether or not that cloud development reaches pyro-CB thresholds. One of those is the cloud top temperature, which is minus 38 degrees, and the other is the presence of lightning strikes. But you can also get what we call a towering pyrocumulus cloud, so a really deep pyrocumulus cloud, which can develop very rapidly, and that was what we saw over the Green Valley fire. And it's really, in some ways, it's a continuum of processes that will go all the way through to pyro-CB or lightning initiation, but you can still see the same sorts of hazards associated with the fire, fire behaviour on the fire ground when you've got a really deep pyrocumulus cloud, even if there's no lightning detected.
Thank you. And just in terms of the Badger fire, from your case analysis of that fire, was there a pyrocumulus nimbus event that occurred within the Badger forest fire on the 31st of December 2019?
Yes, from the Badger fire, I'd have to go back and check the report, but my recollection is that there were multiple pulses of pyro-CB over that fire. One was in the overnight period, and then I think there was another one during the afternoon.
What I might do now, if it's convenient, Dr. Peace, is to bring up a video that was taken by Mr. Ashley Drummond of a column or a plume of smoke in the Green Valley area on the 30th of December 2019. There's a still image of this particular video contained within your report, but I'll have it played through because it may be that you're able to speak to some aspects of the formation of this plume, given your evidence a short while ago.
I'm not seeing.
Yeah. Did you see that, Dr. Peace?
No, I'm not seeing it. Oh, it's starting to come up now. It's just loading. It's a bit slow. No, I'm afraid I'm not seeing it down the link.
Right. If you just look at the monitor, I'm hopeful that it will come up onto your monitor as part of the feed. You see it now?
No, unfortunately, I don't.
What I might do is, you've provided to my instructing solicitors a still image of that video taken by Mr. Drummond at about 5:30 on the 30th of December, together with 3 other still photographs taken by Mr. Scott Anderson at about 5:36 p.m. on that same afternoon. If I bring that up now, I might just ask you to explain the different features of what we see in each of those 4 images in relation to the concept of a pyrocumulus event together with the phenomenon known as a fire-generated vortex.
Yeah. So this is figure 12 in the longer report, the rotating vortex that was taken at 17:30 by Ashley Drummond. And what we're seeing in that is not cloud. All of that is the smoke from the fire. So any overlying cloud is actually above the level of what the level that video was taken. And one of the important points about this is that the spatial scale, thank you, I can see it now. So the image on the left, the spatial scale is hundreds of metres across. So what we're actually looking at is a rotating convection column, and you can see the rotation in the photograph, which is very clear in the video. You can see that rotation. All of that is smoke. Any cloud is higher up than the level of what's being shown in the image. And it's rotating relatively slowly when we're talking about the fire speeds that we'll talk about, the wind speeds that we'll talk about in a fire-generated vortex. It's rotating relatively slowly, but it's a really coherent convection column. So it's a very organised convection column. And we'd make that distinction from a fire plume, which tends to tilt downwind a little bit more and not have that degree of organisation in it. So the energy associated with that system is really quite phenomenal. We have seen similar videos from fires in the United States where you start to see that organised, coherent, rotating convection column. The photographs on the right were taken, I understand, at the
Sorry
light.
to cut you off, Dr. Peace.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. Before you move on to those other three, just in terms of the density or the depth in relation to the figure on the left, figure 2, do you have any idea as to the extent of that plume or convective column that formed within Green Valley on the 30th of December 2019, or not?
Yeah, so the depth of the column was probably around about 5 kilometres deep, because we know that was the height of the boundary layer from the aerological diagram that was taken at Wagga Airport earlier in the day. So the depth of our boundary layer is about 5 kilometres. So that's the depth of the rotating convection column would be inferred from what we're seeing on the photograph. Now, above that, we can see in the satellite imagery that there was reasonably rapidly developing pyro-Q in the afternoon through that period. And around about the time that the fire-generated vortex developed, we actually see in the satellite imagery that matched quite rapid development of the cloud. And we can make that inference from how quickly the cloud top temperatures change in the satellite imagery.
Thank you. Now, in terms of what Her Honour sees in the 3 photographs marked figure 3A, B and C, what is it about those images that are different to what we see in figure 2?
So these images were provided to us by the New South Wales Police, and our understanding is that the images on the right were taken at the Lightwood property. And what that's showing is a fire-generated vortex, which is emerging from the main fire front and then tracking in the photographs from right to left, which would be from west to east. Now, what you can see when you compare the 2 photographs is that the difference in spatial scale is really quite significant. So the one on the left is several hundreds of metres across. The one on the right is the order of tens of metres across. So it's the one on the right, which is the fire-generated vortex, which we understand then impacted the fire truck as it moved away from the fire front. And one of the things that you can see in that sequence of photographs on the right, which is consistent with what we know about fire-generated vortices, is that the vortex develops on the active fire front, so it develops where the active flames are, and then it actually tracks ahead of the active fire front and moves independently into unburned ground.
Thank you. What I might do is have brought up figure 16 of your report, which is a schematic model.
Yeah.
And hopefully that can be brought up because it's helpful to, I think, put in a diagrammatical format what you've just described. Please bear with us.
That's right.
Now, the FGV that has in effect spun out of the main column, do we see that to the right of the main column?
Yes, that's what we indicated in the schematic. So the larger convection column on top of the hill, which is in part driven by that really high energy release from the heavy fuels. And then ahead of that, we know from the photographs and also the reports that there were a lot of spotting. There was a lot of spotting, a lot of spot fires. And then the fire-generated vortex developed in the lee slope on the valley floor and then moved away from the main fire front. So this schematic that we had Barry and I had drawn up for RFS as a communication piece. But the difference in spatial scale is really quite significant. And we know from research that's been done for 100 years or more that lee slopes are a favourable location for vortices to form. So when we're looking at vortices in general, not just fire associated, but generally when you're looking at vortex development, and a nice way to think of this as an analogy is either a spinning top or stirring a spoon in a teacup. You need 2 components to get the vortex to form. One of them is what we call the spin component, which is the flick to get it started. And once these things are started, they tend to be self-sustaining. And the other thing is the stretching component. So you've got to have that vertical stretching component to stretch the vortex. And the updraft above the fire, particularly for a fire burning in heavy fuels, you get a lot of up motion. We know from the observations that was up to around about 5 kilometres deep, and then we had a cloud layer above that. So that really deep stretching component is part of what supported the vortex formation.
You mentioned one of the ingredients that can assist the formation of a fire-generated vortices, which is being on the lee side of a slope. The area where the fire truck was found on its roof, was that, to your understanding, on the lee side of a slope in that general area?
Yeah, that can be seen reasonably clearly from the satellite imagery.
Are there any other common ingredients that your research has led you to identify in relation to the generation of a fire-generated vortice?
One of the things that you have to have is moderate winds, or winds that aren't too strong, because these vortices are obviously vertically stacked. So if you've got too much wind above the surface, they tend to tilt over, and that tilting will distort the coherence of the vortex. So you can't have too strong wind conditions because they need to be reasonably upright. And that upright nature is obviously supported by to some extent by being in a lee slope, because a lot of the environmental wind will often run over the top of the lee slope. The heavy fuels are definitely a factor, because that's how you get your really, really strong updraft. But I think one point that's important to make is that you get these fire whirls or fire-generated vortices really frequently on fires. They're not uncommon. There's a multitude of reports about fire whirls on fires. One of the questions that, from a research point of view, and looking at the Green Valley case in particular, and also events that have happened in the United States last fire season, is what the combination of ingredients are that transition a fire whirl to a vortex which has got tornado strength winds in it. So yes, you get small fire whirls frequently, but the combination of ingredients that will actually produce something that's got tornado strength winds, which can be consistent with an F3 or an F4 tornado, we don't fully understand. Just
in terms of that categorisation of tornadoes, you've mentioned F3 and F4. Does it go up to F5?
Yes, so it goes from EF0, so Fujita scale is the F, and it goes from 0 to 5, and that's the tornado categories.
In terms of EF3, in terms of wind speed that a fire-generated vortice could generate, what sort of speeds are we talking about for an EF3 category tornado?
So for an EF3 tornado, 218 to 265 kilometres an hour.
In relation to the events that unfolded within Green Valley on the 30th of December 2019, did you and your colleague form the opinion that, at the very least, winds within that range were likely to have been generated?
Yeah, so we looked at reports and research that have been done in the United States, which is obviously where they see the most tornadoes. And we're not talking about fire-generated tornadoes now, because there aren't detailed reports on them. These are tornadoes associated with severe thunderstorms. And from the work that we could find from the United States, it correlated car movements, so vehicle movements, with categories of tornadoes. And the work that we found showed that cars being lifted and moved, so as opposed to cars actually kind of being shifted along the ground, but cars that were lifted or tipped were consistent with an EF3 tornado, which is those wind strengths from 218 to 265 kilometres an hour. Now, obviously, a fire truck is an order of magnitude heavier than a normal passenger vehicle. Passenger vehicle is probably about a tonne. As far as we're aware, the fire truck fully loaded was something like 10 to 12 tonnes. But we didn't have any information that we could really correlate against vehicles of that weight for obvious reasons. So we concluded in the report that it was certainly consistent with an EF3 tornado, but potentially stronger winds due to the size and the weight of the fire truck.
In relation to that possibility of stronger winds, did you express the opinion that it is possible that the wind speeds at Green Valley may have corresponded with an EF4 tornado, which has wind speeds in the vicinity of 266 to 320 kilometres per hour?
Yes, that was what we concluded in the report. But obviously there's very little scientific evidence on what wind speeds are required to lift a vehicle of that weight.
Are there any forecasting mechanisms in relation to a fire-generated vortices, a prediction tool or not?
No, not at this stage. So when we do our fire weather forecast, in fact, when we do our forecast in general, the spatial scale of the numerical weather prediction models that we use is 1.5 kilometres. So our operational weather models are 1.5 kilometres, whereas these features are obviously a different order of magnitude. They're tens of metres across. So we don't have forecasting tools that can predict fire-generated vortices. But having said that, from the 2019-2025 season here and also the 2025 season in the United States. We've got researchers in both countries who are now working at understanding some of the formation dynamics of fire-generated vortices, and it's unlikely we'll be able to predict them deterministically, but we're certainly working towards looking at what are the favourable environments and what are some of the ingredients that we can look at, and then potentially looking at identifying warning areas. But that's really been motivated by recent events.
And finally, for my part, Dr. Peace, the destructive winds that took place on the late afternoon of the 30th of December in the Green Valley area, do you consider that a highly rare weather event that unfolded on that day or not?
Yeah, definitely. So the only other case that we're aware of in Australia where we had a similar event that was recorded, and obviously if there's no observations, then these things aren't recorded, would be the Canberra tornado in 2003. So there was a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, so a fire-generated thunderstorm over Canberra in 2003, and there was a verified fire-generated tornado associated with that event. So that's over 10 years ago now. But those are the two that have been well documented here in Australia.
Thank you, Dr. Peace. There may be some other questions.
Mr. Free.
No questions, Your Honour.
Mr. Sakalos.
No questions, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Dr. Peace. You're excused.
Thanks, Your Honour.
Your Honour, that concludes the evidence pertaining to the inquest into the death of Samuel McPaul. If it's convenient to Your Honour, could I make some closing remarks now?
Thank you. Your
Honour now has the benefit of the documentary material contained within Exhibit 12 and the oral testimony from Detective Acting Inspector Elkanza, Senior Constable Mark Lester, RFS members Matthew Hicks, Rodney O'Keefe, Andrew Goody. Today, Your Honour, has also heard evidence from Sergeant Fenton, ICAM Lead Investigator Mr Edwards, Forensic Accident Investigator Mark Scullthorpe, and of course just now from Senior Research Scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology, Dr Marika Peace. Your Honour has also had the benefit of hearing, we'll hear shortly, the words of Christine McPaul, Sam's mother, and Megan McPaul's, Sam's wife, by way of family statements. Before we come to those family statements, can I say to Your Honour now that at a later stage in Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, those assisting Your Honour will formally address Your Honour on the manner and cause of Samuel McPaul's death. In that regard, I can foreshadow that a formal submission is likely to be made that Samuel McPaul died while fighting the Green Valley Fire on the Lightwood property in the Gingelic area on the 30th of December 2019. At approximately 5:45 p.m, a fire-generated vortex impacted with the truck, causing it to overturn. The cause of Samuel's death was traumatic asphyxia as a result of the accident. Your Honour, I understand that my learned friend Ms Stevens will read on behalf of Christine McPaul, Sam's mother, a family statement, together with a statement from Megan McPaul, Sam's wife, and I understand that there are some photographs that will be shown as part of those family statements.
Thank you, Mr. Castleton.
Thank you, Your Honour. I have first a statement from Chris, who is Sam's mother, and we have a number of photos that will be displayed on the screen. Your Honour, this first photograph is a photo of Sam at around 12 months. Chris says as follows: Samuel Ian McPaul was born on Friday the 25th of January 1991 at Marika Hospital. Throughout my pregnancy and at the time of Sam's birth, I was confined to a wheelchair. So this meant Sam had to get used to a unique lifestyle and doing everyday things a bit differently. This had its challenges at times because from a very early age, Sam was full of energy and always on the go. This is a photograph of Chris and Sam on his first Christmas. Although Sam was an only child, he had a second mum in his Auntie Gay, and he considered her 6 children his much-loved brothers and sisters. They were a band of adventurers and spent many hours exploring the surrounding bushland. Sam also loved reading and was rarely without a book in his reach. In Year 6, he won the Dorothea McKellar Poetry Award for his recital of The Man from Ironbark, and in 2003 won the Taronga Foundation Poetry Prize for his poem Parente, which was published in an anthology of poems by young Australians. This is a photograph, Your Honour, of Sam's graduation. He moved from his coastal hometown Marooya in 2011 to attend Charles Sturt University, graduating in 2014 with a bachelor's degree in animal science. This, Your Honour, is a photograph of Sam with his champion duck. Sam loved all types of animals. Over the years, he raised over 100 chooks, ducks, geese and turkeys. He became an avid poultry breeder, winning many class and champion ribbons. During his primary school years, Sam had a pet pig he called Duchess, who he regularly played hide and seek and football with. Not being able to find employment in the Holbrook area in his chosen field, he worked long hours on numerous properties around the area doing farm work. And when a new career opportunity arose, he took up as an apprentice mechanic in Colcan, completing it in under 2 years. This was no surprise to close family members as he came from a long line of vintage car enthusiasts. Sam enjoyed his work environment and those he worked with at Fitzy's in Colcan. Sam's other passion was playing basketball. He played at local level in Marooya, Wagga and Holbrook, and for Wagga in the State Basketball League. Sam always wanted to give back to the sport he loved so much, becoming a coach of mini-ball and the under-12 teams while refereeing local competitions and participating on the Wagga Basketball Board. In 2006, Sam was awarded the Pierre de Coubertin Award, presented by the Australian Olympic Committee, recognising his sporting achievements. Your Honour, the next photograph is of his granddad, Edward, and then his nana, Elizabeth, and that is, of course, Sam as well. And again, his nana when Sam was older. He had a very close relationship with his nan and granddad and kept in touch with them regularly when he moved away to university and when he set up a home with his soulmate, Megan. Sam met Meg at university and they married in a romantic ceremony in April 2018. This, Your Honour, is a photograph of Meg and Chris with Sam. Sam cherished his family. He always made time to connect with family when he returned to the far south coast on his breaks and on weekends. He stayed in touch with his uncle Alan through cryptic text messages that usually related to the latest car project or home renovation he was undertaking. His family remembers him in their own special way. Jennifer, Your Honour, and this is Sam and Jennifer, recalls Sam being the greatest friend more like a twin brother, and in the 29 years they shared their lives, they never missed a birthday, christening, wedding or family celebration. Here is a more recent photo of Jennifer with Sam. She says he was always the first to arrive at family functions with his big smile and boisterous, infectious laugh, and the last to leave after helping to clean up when all the guests had gone. She says he would make contact like a text or phone call at just the right time, even when you didn't realise you needed it, and completely brighten your mood. Sam always put others' needs before his own, even strangers. His goofy smile and jokes are missed every day. Your Honour, this is Laura with Sam. Laura says she remembers Sam's warm smile and loud laugh, his fearless singing and very distinct deep voice. He was there through her teenage years and when she needed an ear, and he was a good listener. She lovingly remembers his casual, cool and calm manner, his love for animals of all kinds, and his addiction to everything about basketball. She misses him every day and will always remember him. Next, Your Honour, are Jacob and Daniel, shown here with Sam at Jacob's wedding. Jacob recalls that Sam was the most confident, strong-headed, honourable, caring and righteous person I knew. He set high standards for himself and was a loyal friend and loving family member. He was a great man, which has had a big impact on who I am as a husband, father, son and man. Sam was and always will be the big brother I look up to. Daniel remembers Sam as a true friend and brother. He is and always will be the hero I will look up to and the man I strive to be like. I will pass down stories about Sam to my children so they too will know that he was a selfless, loving and courageous person who ultimately gave everything to help those in need. Next, Your Honour, from Rebecca. This is Rebecca, her husband Kirk, and their daughter Aurora. Rebecca says, "My heart is filled with love and pride as Sam's big sister. I watched him grow from an awkward, fun-loving, clever little bookworm into a responsible, kind and generous man who had deep dreams and hopes for his young family. But my heart also aches every day that Sam's best friends and brothers will never experience being husbands and fathers together. Our family now has a huge hole that was once filled with Sam's cheeky smile and loving personality. But despite our deep grief, we continue to reminisce about the wonderful years we shared together. Our children will know their Uncle Sam as a hero, and we honour his name by living our lives with honour." Finally, Your Honour, from Auntie Gay. This is, of course, a photo of Sam, very small, at the beach. Auntie Gay recalls, "The day you were born was a wonderful summer's day, and your presence filled our lives with joy and love the moment you were born. You adapted quickly to balancing on your mum's lap in a wheelchair, a skill that probably helped hone your sporting skills. You were a busy child with a creative and inventive mind. You always dreamed big, pressed on towards your goals and touched many lives with your compassion and courage." Anyone who knew Sam never forgot their connections with him, whether school friends, teammates, work colleagues or community members. Your Honour, this is a photo of Chris and Sam. She says, to conclude her family statement, "I am proud to have shared such a deep and close relationship with my son Sam. He was my only child, my best friend, my entire world. He had grown into an amazing, hard-working and talented young man with a wonderful future ahead of him. Just 1 year before the accident, Sam and Meg moved me from Moruya on the south coast to my new home in Kalkan, where I bought a renovator's dream, as Sam called it. He had many ideas and grand plans for its improvement. Sam and Meg had planned to start a family, and I was eager to become a grandparent. Sam was so excited and couldn't wait to become a dad in May of 2020. It breaks my heart that he never met his longed-for and beautiful boy. Sam was the sunshine in my days and the wind beneath my wings. He was always there for me. I miss him every minute of the day. And I'll now read on behalf of Meg her statement, and she has a number of photos that go with it. Firstly, Your Honour, we've been told by Meg that this is Sam with the cat named Squeak. Sam is unlike anyone you would have met before. In a crowd of people, he seemed so confident and engaging. He was able to put a smile on anyone's face, no matter how long he had known them. He was someone who would really listen and help whenever possible. However, he was always offering up his own opinion, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Sam would be the first to offer up his weekends or his free time after work to help people move house, to teach them basketball or catch up. He had a huge heart and was always helping everyone out. Sam was wildly crazy about his sport, not just one sport, but all sports. His favourite times were when the Olympics were on and also when the NBA playoff time was on. Basketball was his passion, as was, but by no comparison, his family. Sam's love for our little family only grew as each day passed. We had 2 dogs and a cat and had a bub on the way. Sam was super excited and he would never stop talking about our future and where our family would end up. He envisaged opening his own mechanic shop while I continued with the embryology work, and a basketball team of our own kids following us around. Sam felt that our opportunities were endless because all our little family needed was someone to believe in them and support them. That person was Sam. His infectious smile, his heart of gold, his loud voice, and most of all, his love is missed each and every day by those who are closest to him. Your Honour, we thank both Chris and Meg for those words and the photographs in order to demonstrate to the court what a man he obviously was.
Thank you, Ms Stevens. And I'd also like to thank Sam's mother, Chris, and Sam's wife, Megan, for those absolutely beautiful words about Sam. There certainly is a common theme in just looking at some of the words that were spoken just then. Jennifer, Sam often puts the needs of others before his own, even strangers. And Daniel, he was selfless, loving and courageous. He was a selfless, loving and courageous person who ultimately gave everything to help those in need. And that is absolutely true. He is someone who deserves an enormous debt of gratitude from the entire community for what he did that day when he so tragically lost his life. So thank you.
Your Honour, that concludes the inquest into the death of Samuel McPaul. Would Your Honour formally stand the matter over to the 5th of September 2022?
Yes, I'll do that now.
Thank you, Your Honour. That concludes this week's proceedings. Next week, Your Honour, will be inquiring into a number of fires and also into the inquest into the death of David Harrison. On Monday, Your Honour, will commence proceedings in relation to the Duns Road, Ellerslie Fire and the East Ernie Creek Fire. And following that, the inquest into the death of David Harrison. At the conclusion of that inquest, I apprehend Your Honour will then move into the fire inquiry relating to the Adaminaby complex fire, followed by the Border Rockton fire later in the week.
Thank you, Mr Castleton. We'll adjourn now until Monday, 10 a.m.
Please, the Court.